Ukrainian president called for an immediate end to Russia's war and criticised the Red Cross at the G20 summit in Indonesia on Tuesday.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky calls the liberation of the Kherson city the beginning of the end of the war.
France and Italy continue a dispute over humanitarian rescue ships as Paris and London sign a historic English Channel crossing deal.
Ukraine's president has delivered an impassioned speech at the G20 summit in Indonesia's Nusa Dua on Tuesday, connecting with fellow world leaders via video link. Volodymyr Zelensky's message was clear and uncompromising. Russia's war must end now.
We won't give Russia the chance to wait over, rebuild forces, and then unleash a new wave of terror and global destabilization. I'm sure that we need and might end this destructive war of Russia immediately.
Zelensky called for an extension to the Black Sea grain deals struck between the UN and Russia in July. He also criticised the International Committee of the Red Cross, which he says hasn't been trying hard enough to reach Ukrainian prisoners in Russia.
I must say that we haven't found support from the ICRC. We haven't seen that they are fully engaged in getting access to prisoner camps where Ukrainian captives and political prisoners are being held, or that the Red Cross has helped search for deported Ukrainians. Such self-elimination is the self-destruction of the Red Cross, which is an organisation that was once respected. We can't wait, and we must unite under a single and realistic model of freeing the prisoners, and also for freeing all children and adults who were deported to Russia.
Russian leader Vladimir Putin isn't attending the summit, instead sending Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. He's expected to hold some bilateral talks before leaving the Indonesian island early, what Zelensky calls the G19 summit.
The leaders of the G20 nations and other international heads get down to business today in Bali for the annual summit. The event is being overshadowed by Russia's war in Ukraine. Although President Vladimir Putin has pulled out, Russia is being represented by Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. Even so, officials say an end-of-summit statement will be issued in which most members are expected to condemn Russia's aggression. There have been several significant bilateral meetings on the sidelines of the main summit, including talks between the presidents of France and China, during which several issues were raised.
You mentioned the climate issue, to name just one, and probably the most important one. But also there are international crises like Russia's war in Ukraine, for which the G20 is an appropriate format.
Xi, meanwhile, made no mention of the conflict in his opening remarks, calling more broadly for the two countries to uphold the spirits of independence, autonomy, openness and cooperation. This is a summit of several introductions, including the first in-person talks between President Xi and US President Joe Biden, who said afterwards the meeting had been conciliatory. Topics included Ukraine, Taiwan and human rights. The G20, which is being held in Indonesia against a backdrop of numerous sources of tension, is the biggest gathering by the group of leaders since the start of the coronavirus pandemic.
Smiles and a handshake between the American and Chinese leaders, Joe Biden and Xi Jinping, at the G20 summit in Bali. It's their first face-to-face meeting since Biden took office. Relations between the two world powers have grown frosty under successive American administrations, with issues such as trade, human rights and the status of Taiwan causing friction. But for now, at least, there's talk of limited cooperation.
I'm committed to keeping the lines of communications open between you and me personally, but our governments across the board, because our two countries have so much that we have an opportunity to deal with.
China's foreign ministry has said that the country is committed to peaceful coexistence, but would firmly defend its sovereignty, security and development interests. Despite the differences, lines of communication at the highest level remain open.
Tears of joy and relief overcame Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky during his surprise visit to Kherson city. His troops have regained control of the region's capital, and for the president, emboldened by his men's efforts, this could spark the beginning of the end of the war.
It was not so pleasant when I saw the number of destroyed houses, the number of destroyed ordinary coffee shops. This is what the Russian Federation did in our country. It showed the whole world that it can kill. But all of us, our armed forces, our intelligence, have shown that it's impossible to kill Ukraine.
In Russia, meanwhile, the silence is telling as it played down its withdrawal of troops from the region.
We leave it without comments. You know that it's the territory of the Russian Federation.
The NATO Secretary-General did have something to say. From The Hague, Jens Stoltenberg reminded us that the conflict is far from over and the months ahead will be challenging.
The coming months will be difficult. Putin's aim is to leave Ukraine cold and dark this winter. So we must stay the course.
Indeed, the Russians destroyed Kherson's basic infrastructure before abandoning the city, which augurs very difficult times. For the residents, readapting will take a long time. But for now, the joy is there for us all to see.
As Kherson emerges from occupation, Ukraine's troops are reclaiming the city metre by metre, making safe buildings abandoned by the Russians. Locals have been celebrating the Russian retreat, but without essentials like a functioning water supply, residents have been driven to desperate measures.
I can say that we're dealing with a municipal catastrophe. We have no water, no electricity, no heating. That's why we're forced somehow to cope with it. It's a real pity that my children have to face such a situation. I have 2 small children here and we haven't managed to leave. But thank God, we're all alive and our houses are okay.
Ukraine's technicians are trying to repair a major power station, which previously supplied the entire right bank of the Kherson region. The chief of Ukraine's national energy supplier described the destruction as the consequence of the powerless anger of the occupiers before fleeing. After a surprise visit to the newly liberated city, President Zelensky used his nightly address to condemn Russia as the occupiers who destroy everything. This is their so-called special operation, he said. For Russia, it appears to have been left internationally isolated by the invasion of Ukraine, an impression underlined by the 5th critical UN resolution. It called for Moscow to be held accountable for its actions and was supported by 94 of the General Assembly's 193 members. It said Russia must bear the legal consequences of all of its internationally wrongful acts, including making reparations for injury and damage.
US Democrat Katie Hobbs has defeated her Republican rival Kari Lake in the race for governor of Arizona. It's the first time a Democrat has been elected to lead the state since 2006. Hobbs, who's Arizona's Secretary of State, fiercely defended the legitimacy of the 2020 presidential election, while Lake, a former TV anchor backed by Donald Trump, questioned the results. Lake's defeat is the latest blow for former President Trump, who's been blamed for Republicans' poor showing in this month's midterm elections, including their failure to take control of the US Senate. The party is still expected to win back the House of Representatives from Democrats, but by a much smaller margin than predicted. Trump himself is due to make what he's teased as a big announcement later today, widely expected to be the official launch of his 2024 presidential campaign. But unlike recent years, Republican politicians and voters appeared divided, with some now throwing their support to Florida Governor Ron DeSantis.
As students at the University of Virginia held a vigil for the deaths of 3 of their friends who were shot dead on Sunday, the alleged gunman was finally detained by police. The victims, 3 UVA football players, were killed at the school's main campus in Charlottesville as a bus returned from a class field trip. The suspected shooter, a former player, went on the run, prompting a lockdown of campus. Police have not offered a motive for the attack.